Thank you for all coming today. We've had a wonderful conference so far. And Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks is probably the most important prophecy in the scriptures that relate to the close of the age and also the wrap-up of the Gentile powers. It's somewhat sensitive information. Daniel 9:27 is probably the most sensitive verse in the whole of the scripture of the Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. Just between Daniel 9:24 and 9:27, those four verses, they are dynamite. So be aware of that. And it stirs your hearts a little bit, and it stirs the hearts of other people when you ask questions about those issues. And there's a huge amount of disinformation coming in concerning the future 70th week, and that's what we're going to address today. That's where I come from here. Good country. I won't say any more at the moment. I came to the US some years ago when I was a kid. That's me here. And I met my wife, and she's up the muzzle end of the cannon. The blonde in the blue, and there she is in the back there. And we met when we were 11, yeah. And then I ended up going back to Australia, and then I took a year off and went around the world after internship and spent some time in England and did a mission work in India. But on the way, we went back and visited people in America where we'd spent some years, and met my wife at that time. The rest is history. Okay, back to the main story. Basically, the prophecy of the 70 weeks is going to open up a huge amount of wonderful information for us. First of all, it's going to reveal the fact that Messiah comes to us in two presentations of himself. First as the suffering servant, and secondly as the conquering king. He comes in those two offices, which we'll talk about shortly. And there's a gap between the two, and the preterists do not want you to accept that there's a gap. But what if Messiah died? What if he was cut off? Would that be sufficient for a gap? So this is what we started out with, the 7-year tribulation. And when I came to the States way back in the 70s, there were people talking about the future 70th week and this final 7-year tribulation. So that was a good start, because it was Sir Robert Anderson that gave us the opportunity to know that there was a future 70th week. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through the NASA moon phase data rather quickly. I'm going to show you how to create your own Hebrew calendar and have it right most of the time, so that you can be fully informed about these things and be assured that what you're being told is correct. And then you'll end up with something like this, and we won't be able to show the basis for all these things today, but tomorrow the fall feasts are there, the Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, and the Day of Atonement. We're going to find out that they bracket the final 7 years of the age very, very wonderfully. And we've got an error factor of four-figure error factor of 99.99%. That's pretty darn good. And even better than that when we deal with the 69 weeks, which we will shortly. It's important to appreciate that the 70 weeks prophecy came to us out of a prayer. And there's a whole lot of information in the prayer, as well as the details of the technical details of what's been shown. God is a forgiving God. And so the issue is that Daniel knew God as a harsh, true, righteous God. But even though he's given a rough rap about all the rough things that are happening, he still comes back and he says, yes, but we know that beyond all this, there's a merciful heart in your character. And he doesn't let go of his God. And that's an important lesson for us, because tough times are coming and a lot of people are going to let go of their God. And so we need to know that behind it all, there's a loving God who's waiting for his people to come home in both houses. So here we have Daniel. He says, yes, all Israel have transgressed thy law. He says, all Israel. So Doug was saying that he goes through the whole Bible for a whole lot of his life, and then finally he starts to realize that there's two houses. And so we're going to see that there's mention of two houses here inside the Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks. all Israel have transgressed our law, even by departing. So the word departing there is interesting, and that doesn't necessarily, the prophecy is not exhausted by a moral departing. How about a physical walkout? Well, there's your physical walkout right there, and that's what Daniel's referring to. He's referring to the time when the house of Israel walked out on the Jewish house and said, "Up yours, David," and basically cursed David and walked out. This is a huge issue, and nobody wants to talk about this. It's not anything that the people who want to unhitch the Old Testament, they don't want this information to go to you guys, because it's got critical information for you to be powerful in the latter days and see the greater works and move on to do the glories. So Daniel's talking about, Lord, forgive. So there's nothing wrong with asking for forgiveness. Nothing wrong at all. And he's mentioning the two elements here. And the rest of this presentation, blue will be relating to the house of Judah, the royal Jewish house, which relates to God's law, the scepter, the king, and then the congregation here, the people. You start to see that in the scriptures. It'll start to pop out at you. So he's praying for the city and the people. And while he's speaking, praying, as soon as the prayer went and reached the throne of heaven, the answer was given. So it's not as if God is sitting there twiddling his thumbs waiting to say, "Oh, I'm waiting for my time." He responds immediately. The question is, how quickly are we able to receive the answer? Ola was talking about that in the previous presentation. So he's mentioning the sin of my people Israel, and before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God. So when he's talking about a mountain, he's talking about a nation. So here again, he's talking about a people, a congregation, and he's talking about a nation. So there's your two handles on God's covenant people, which you'll see all through the scriptures: the two witnesses, the two angels over the Ark of the Covenant, the two candles that the ladies light at Sabbath, the two olive trees, on and on and on it goes. The answer comes, and God answers in relationship to the specific details that Daniel's talking about. 70 weeks are determined, cut out of time, upon thy people and upon thy holy city. So how much clearer could it get? He's talking about the two handles that God has on his covenant people: a nation and a congregation. And here we have the same situation going back to Abraham's promise, the Abrahamic covenant, unconditional covenant. God says, "I'm going to do this." He carried Abraham through the blood. Kingdom and a priesthood, a holy city and a holy people, a nation and a congregation, all wrapped up in the Abrahamic covenant, which we are partakers of right now. And don't let any man or devil tell you otherwise. I don't care if it's in the Old Testament. You want to unhitch it, it can be rehitched real quickly. And you guys are just the people to do it. So to achieve what? What's the purpose? To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation. There's atonement. So there is your Yom Kippur. That's your final wrap-up. That's your final reconciliation, your final day of accounting, day of pardoning, day of sentencing. It's Judgment Day, and this is obviously related to the close of the age. So we can't get around that. To bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy.
The most holy what?
Place. So then we move on to the edict. What gave the initiation for this 70-year prophecy? And so we see that there's special mention of the gates and the walls. And that is what initiated the 70 weeks prophecy. There's all sorts of other conversations about Cyrus, and Cyrus did say, let it be built, no question. But as far as people coming to the ruler and making that deal. But that didn't happen until, well, we're going to find out. Well, you can probably get an idea here. Who's building these walls? It's Nehemiah. So gates and walls, they're both important. So this is Jaffa Gates. So when he's talking about gates, he's not just talking about a hinged structure to defend the city. This is the town hall. This is the place where political sovereignty is established, and the economic military control point of the city. So these gates are all control points, and nobody goes in to the city unless they go through those control points. They're governmental things. So the reestablishment of the walls is critical as far as getting that sovereignty restored. And that was a huge deal. It's a big deal. When Nehemiah returned back to rebuild the walls, you can think of what the city looked like. It was a mess. And yet, Ezra had led a great biblical revival back there some 13 years before. And also the temple had been rebuilt some 70-something years before, back in the previous century. So it was a mess because there was no integrity of the city until this happened. So the renewal project was not just a civic, let's just fix up the infrastructure. This was a matter of reestablishing Jerusalem as a self-governing city-state. And that's a big deal. And the Jewish house was well known for being rather pugnacious. And so here's Nehemiah. He's going to the king and he's asking for permission to restore the city of Jerusalem so that the people could self-govern. And he's asking to meet a Persian superpower, the king, to do that. And the nerve of the guy, I mean, he could have been killed for that. This was a big deal. So Nehemiah arrives, and as we can see, he gives a report. He goes by night because there's no security in the city. He doesn't want to go by day because it'll stir up trouble. So he's going by night to inspect the city, and it's a complete, total mess. And so there's no question that the rebuilding of the city and the gates and walls does not occur until Nehemiah. And so we've got absolute proof here that this is a confirmation, a fulfillment of the prophecy, the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. Nehemiah did it. Nobody did that job before Nehemiah. And he was trembling before he went before the king. So the next thing is, because there's our start point. It's got the month of Nisan. We've got a pretty good time fix on the initiation of the 70 weeks prophecy. It's in the month of Nisan. We don't know when. We're not told when, but we're going to find out that we've got a tight little wiggle room here as we move on, because we go on now to the question of the prince, Messiah the prince. So what might that sentinel event be? This is Messiah presenting himself in a decidedly political role. And you'll remember all the time that Jesus was doing his miracles, he would ask them not to talk about him being Messiah. As soon as he did miracles, people would say, "Oh, you must be the Messiah." And he said, "Don't say anything about me being the Messiah." But on this day that we're going to talk about shortly, he actually became Messiah the Prince. So when we hear people say, "Oh, the birth of Jesus," we can make an extension going back to Cyrus to the birth of Jesus. No good chronology there, no dates, and there's no Hebrew calendar dates to peg on. And the little baby is not fulfilling the prophecy of Messiah the Prince. Okay. Neither is his baptism. But that is what we see as a big competing chronology against Sir Robert Anderson's Nehemiah to Palm Sunday chronology. And so here we have the beginning of the 70 weeks prophecy. Know therefore and understand from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So he's talking about 7 weeks and then 62 weeks. And so there's no indication of any pause or any waypoint there, but it's just presented as 7 weeks and 62 weeks. There's nothing given in there that would indicate there's an event on earth between the 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It's just stated that way. Why would God do that? So he's giving this 7 by 7 message at the beginning. So if you hear the word 7 by 7, what does that sort of remind you of? The Jubilee, yeah. And here we go. We've got scads of connections to the Jubilee, to the 70 weeks prophecy, indicating that God's wrapped up all the Jubilee talk and the Shemitah talk inside his 70 weeks prophecy. And so you've got 10 blocks of 49 years for the 70 weeks prophecy. It's 490 years. 70 times 7 is 490. And 10 blocks of 49, 490. There's your 10 Jubilees packed up there like sardines inside the 70 weeks prophecy. And we're going to discover that there's something more wonderful going on too. Because when we look at the conclusion of the final 70th week, what happens then? And if it's on the Day of Atonement, what trumpet is blown on the Day of Atonement at the end of a 49-year cycle? The trumpet of Jubilee, which fits in with the musicians who have given us the songs, for unto Zion comes a deliverer in the year of Jubilee. So the theologians don't know that, but the songwriters, the artists have got connections to the things of God, sometimes better than the pipe-smoking theologians in the seminaries. So be on the alert for the artists. They can bring us some absolute demonic junk, but on the other hand, they can give us some very wonderful truths at the same time. Sir Isaac Newton, he was one of the greatest mathematicians, physicists. He was an astronomer, a scholar, a theologian, a brilliant scientist. Probably he developed the laws of motion, gravity, had a problem with one of his calculations one afternoon and developed calculus, and a brilliant guy, and one of the most influential scientists of all times. And he spent a large chunk of his time in Bible prophecy, and he would work very hard to try to understand the 70 weeks prophecy, but he could not. And the question is, why not? Was he a Christian man if you spent so much time in the Bible? Well, that's very hard to answer. It would be nice to say that he was, but he was of Arian disposition. He did not believe that Jesus was God. That's a big problem. We've talked about that with some of our colleagues recently. It's a huge issue, a stumbling block. So he worked on it, and he came up with this, which is basically a timeline that runs from Ezra in 457 BC, which is about 12 or 13 years before Nehemiah, running on to 27 AD. And that was the best he can do. And he's running it with solar years of 365.24 years. So, and he's coming in within the bull's roar of the ministry of Jesus. And so that is what led to some problems, because it's actually a year short of the baptism of Jesus. But he said that, well, we're close here. So he had a wonderful mind, and I'm not saying that he did anything in the way of opening the door to what followed, but because it happened centuries later. But he did open the door to preterism, partial preterism. Basically, what happened is that he opened the door to for people to say, let's chop off the first half of the future 70th week. And we've got evidence of tribulation. Yeah, we can't hide that, even though full preterists will try to hide the whole of the 70th week and say it's happened back in the 70 AD or some such nonsense. But in this situation, what we're getting is a huge amount of people who are coming in with this hemi-preterism or half preterism, in which they're saying the first half is chopped off from the future 70th week, and it's gone. Look at that. Now you see it. Now you don't. Oh, there it is. Now it's gone. Oops. So that's the game, is to hide things. In other words, there's something in here in that first 3.5 years that the evil spirits of religious principalities and powers, and they may be operating through people who are completely unwitting of what's going on. In other words, they don't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to go and deceive God's covenant people. It's just that, it just seems like, hey, that's a neat thing to do. Oh, we'll just do this. This might fit. Well, it leads to an obfuscation of God's holy word. So here are all the scriptures that relate to the final 3.5 years. There's 7 of them. And it wasn't until just recent years I discovered that there's 7 of them. And so we were just told 7-year tribulation, right? But there's lots of details in the scripture. We've got the Great Tribulation from Daniel 7:25, the scattering of the power of the holy people, Daniel 12:7, the exile of the woman, in 2 verses in Revelation 12:6 and 12:14, the ministry of the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11:2, trampling of Jerusalem, and the reign of the Antichrist. Now, we're going to see how these are all reconciled once you use the right key. Somebody's got to put the key in, it's got to turn all the tumblers to open the prophecy, and we'll see how that happens shortly. So here we know that there's a future tribulation, and it's well known that it's 3.5 years from the prophecies. We're also told about the flight of the woman, exile of the woman of Revelation chapter 12. Nobody wants to talk about that because they want to write off the future 70th week as Chamber of Horrors, but there's some interesting things here. We might speculate on what that means. Chad was talking this morning about the big contest going on between the powers of darkness, the archers trying to celebrate God's people being pulled away, and then there's a reverse back towards Jerusalem. So the powers of darkness. There's a chess game between God and the devil. And so we're going to find out who wins and how he wins it. But at the very end of this exile, if you read Micah chapter 2, you'll see that the breaker comes and he breaks them out in the magnificent deliverance. I mean, these are all marvelous stories that are written in the heavens. They're old as can be. And so here we have the woman of travail, and she's obviously in the second half, as we see in Revelation 12. And then we have to ask ourselves what's going on in here in the first 3.5 years, and that relates to Sir Isaac Newton's chronology. So, what's going on here? Nothing to see here, right? Hey, we pulled that back and shoved it underneath the carpet under the ministry of Jesus. Can't see it. Nothing to see anymore, right? But we've got a God who is overseeing the whole of the end time. It's important to understand God is ruling. He's set his court in heaven. He is watching over the whole of the book of Revelation as the history unfolds of the latter days. He's in charge. So people say, oh, the whole world is spinning out of control, all hell breaks loose. God is in control. The Ancient of Days sits, and he says to his son, sit down here until I make your enemies your footstool. He's going to do the job, brothers and sisters. Don't let any man or devil try to discourage you from this wonderful hope that there's a God who's going to come and deliver his people. And so if you look at the book of Revelation, it can be reviewed as a court case. It can also be looked at as the story of 2 women, right? And then one woman is in travail. She's under some degree of duress. The other woman seems to be having a good time here in the first half, doesn't she? But she won't be having a good time in this part, I can assure you, because if we read Revelation chapter 17, you'll see what happens to this woman. But both pictures have got a beast with 10 horns. Your new world order is manifest here and throughout the whole of the last 7 years. not just the last 3.5 years. And the harlot system is ruling. I just sat through John Haller's presentation on what's happening in the culture today. This woman is riding big time. She is dominating. She is taking over the churches. She is establishing LGBT like you would not believe. And she is about ready to be shoehorning in the New World Order, because the Antichrist, the one who makes the deal, he's too smart to try to come and assume control himself. But he'll use religion to shoehorn in the New World Order at the close of the age. This is sort of information you'll never hear from very many other people, other than a few nutcases like yours truly, who goes and looks into these things. And it's a little bit frightening to look at them sometimes, but God, you'll get over it, okay? Particularly when you realize that God is in control and the Holy Spirit blows out at the close of the age in a glorious climax. According to what Joel said, he saw it when the sun turns to darkness and the moon to blood, and Jesus said that's after the tribulation. Well, between 1260 and 1290 days, 30 days, we're looking at a God who is amply providing his people power for the latter days. And listen to Ola, talking to him yesterday about what's happening in Nigeria. God's people, whenever they go and have genocides against God's people, they go back later and find that the church is stronger than it ever was. And so in the first 300 years, the powers of darkness tried to do a frontal attack upon the church, and they failed miserably. The only way that they could get them was like Balaam said, get them compromised. And that's what happened at the Council of Nicaea. So there's a significant midpoint abomination of desolation here. Most of you are quite familiar with that probably. And then we come to day 1260. That's important. These 1260 days and 1260 days, both of them make up the 70th week, 70 times 360. We'll talk about that in a minute. So here we've got the tribulation, Antichrist. We've got the harlot, and she's obviously going to be used to shoehorn in this new world order to close of the age. So Sir Robert Anderson, finally some good news. I love the guy. When I saw his work, I said we've got to go back through and get the NASA moon phase data and track along. He used calendars. He used the calendars to and connections to the Nisan moons of Nehemiah and the Passion Year to fix the Hebrew calendar to get the days right. And he did a pretty good job. And he was a Bible-believing evangelical Christian, and so God gave him the information to crack the case. He was a Scotland Yard inspector, very diligent man in truth, and that seems to be a big issue. I've got a good friend, Carl Gallops, who is a former sheriff. Same story. Very, very diligent inspector, and very, very, very much a man who loves God's truth. So he, his information is in this book, The Coming Prince, published first at 1890 something. And you can go online. It's in the public domain. You can go online and you can download it onto your phone or your iPad or your computer, and you can read his book. And he'd like you to do that, I can assure you. He doesn't have any copyright issues involved here. He is a godly man, and he is the one who gave us the information to move forward with this whole Bible prophecy of the last 7 years. So here is the Palm Sunday. It actually turns out to be Palm Sabbath, but Sir Robert Anderson recognized that was the day. That was the only day in which he presented himself as Messiah. And it's a specific date that we put on the calendar because that was when the sheep were going up for inspection. It was Nisan 10 of the Passion Year. And so there's our basic connection. And so we've got a big breakthrough here with Sir Robert Anderson and the two verses that gave him the 360-day year, because in Revelation 12, 6 and 12:14, 8 verses apart, we're given good information that they're equivalent because they're both talking about the same thing, the exile of the woman. There are two, we can consider that these two scriptures in Genesis and in Revelation that give us an idea of the biblical month and the biblical year. They're a bit like the Rosetta Stone discovered by the French in Alexandria. They found this stone and they found that it was written in 3 different languages, so they could then understand the hieroglyphics of the Egyptians. So we read in Genesis 7 that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, 17th day of the month, the fountains of the deep were broken up. On the same day, Noah and his family entered the ark, and the Lord shut him in. So God shut him in. He didn't shut the door. God is responsible for judgment, not us. So keep that in mind. So here we have 150 days, and the terminus of the time when the ark rested was on the 17th day of the 7th month. So there's 5 months, and we're told that it's 150 days. We do the math. I mean, this is something that a 6th grader can do, right? Not very complicated. And we end up with a 30-day biblical or prophetic month. So now we turn to the second Rosetta Stone for biblical time in Revelation 12:6 and 12:14, the exile of the woman of wonder. Both verses describe the same event. And so here we find out that 1,260 days equals time times and a half a time, rather cryptically presented to us as 3.5 years. So we do the math there. And we end up with a 360-day year. 1,260 days, 3.5 years, 360-day year, prophetic year. That's what Sir Robert Anderson used to crack the case of the 70 weeks prophecy. And all the tumblers in the lock come together, and they reconcile all 7 verses for the final 3.5 years. 42 months equals 3.5 years, equals 1,260 days. God's laid it out for us to discover. Study to show yourself approved unto God. You find out all sorts of interesting things, you know. So here's our 7 verses again. And these 2 relate to the exile of the woman. And all of these can be reconciled very beautifully. And here we have this great dramatic story, which was probably talked about by the shepherds in the field when they looked up at the stars. And the patriarchs probably talked about it too. Maybe Adam knew about all these things. The ancient patriarchs knew. That's Andromeda on the right. And she's going to be delivered. But she's having a bit of a rough time in the interim. She's being more or less surrounded by the dragon. It's the story of the latter days. Now, is she doomed? Is all lost? Is it all terrible with no hope, no reconciliation, no mercy of God? Well, there's a deliverance, you know. With Andromeda, she's delivered eventually, and gloriously so. And in Micah chapter 2, she's delivered too. The breaker comes. So in Revelation 12, the woman flies off to her place, away from the face of the dragon. So we might speculate, this is somewhat speculative, but, you know, if the face of the dragon, he's crossing the kings of the east across the Euphrates River that's dried up, where's his face? It's in the Middle East here, right? So that's a clue. So if his face is in towards the ultimate lust of the powers of darkness is for that holy city. That's where his face is. So if the face of the dragon is directed towards the Middle East, how likely is it that Petra is going to be the safe place for for tens or hundreds of millions of God's covenant people to be in the latter days. This is a pipsqueak story here. This is right in the face of the dragon. This is no safe place. Circling armies, Armageddon at the close of the age, tanks landing in the north, ships in the south. And we're supposed to believe that all of God's covenant people are going to be holed up in this dry place where there's not much in the way of water. And the other thing is, if you ask any military man how safe that would be, back in the days of old, that city was well defended by swordsmen and by archers because of the narrow entryways. But nowadays, that place of Petra would be a death trap. One gas bomb down there, one fuel bomb would kill everybody in the whole valley. It would asphyxiate them, just like we saw in Cologne and Dresden with the terrible firestorming that we did against civilians in the Second World War. People asphyxiated because of all the oxygen sucked out. This ain't a safe place. And the dragon's face is there. So this other place, Mystery Bozrah, it's got to be somewhere else. So 360 days is the prophetic year, 30 days is a prophetic month. And there's our 2 Rosetta Stones for biblical time or prophetic time. And here's our 7 verses. Now, we got 3.5 years, 3 verses saying that, 2 verses saying 1260 days, 2 verses saying 42 months. Okay, how they reconcile. This is how they reconciled here. Now, if we're going to use Sir Isaac Newton's solar years, what do we end up with? We end up with that. 42 lunar months equals that number. 3.5 solar years equals that. And here's your 1260. Is there any reconciliation there? I mean, this is a mess. There's nothing beautiful here. Would God deliver that mess to us? Probably not, right? I mean, this is enough to give you the screaming memes. So how about that? Does that look better? That looks. Does that satisfy the soul there? Look at that. 1260, all the way down. I mean, that's sort of beautiful, isn't it? It's elegant. I mean, it's fitting for our God to do something like that. So in our spirit, we know that that's right. Sometimes it's helpful to be a little bit charismatic when you go to the details of Scripture. It's not just head knowledge. You know that God is a certain God that does certain things a certain way. Like this, for example, because it leads to this calendar. And this is the calendar that God has sitting on his throne. And when he delivers time to us in terms of days, he delivers it to us in terms of that calendar. And so he's describing a 360-degree circle, and all of these 12 segments are made up of exactly 30 degrees. And so prophetic time laid out in beauty and in truth. Wasn't there a poet, Professor Watson, that talked about beauty and truth? Beauty and truth. That is all you know on earth and all you need to get to know. Wasn't that Keats? Or I can't remember exactly, but he was saying that there is a beauty associated with truth.
The Semites always used the lunar calendar. I mean, Muslims now, Ramadan is in a different date. The Semitic calendar was lunar.
Yes.
It was the Roman calendar that was solar.
Yes.
And I don't think that Daniel would have followed the Roman calendar.
Absolutely not, no. So, and nor would he have followed solar years. He would have been back, apparently, somebody said way back when it was a 360-day year. I don't know whether that was before the flood or whether before the fall, but the world was not messed up as it is. So here we are, and Sir Robert Anderson begins to do his work. he says, right, we got 69 sevens of years, we got 360 days, do the math, and he ends up with this number. That's his number there, 173,880 days. That's the number of days for the 69 weeks, right? So he just plugs it in. He used the calendar to do that, but I used the NASA moon phase data when I did this about 15 years ago, I guess. The NASA moon phase data was up online, but in 2016 they took it down. But they left up the eclipses, but the moon phase data, they pulled it. And now you have to go looking for it to find it. Fortunately, I'll tell you about that in a minute. So 476 years plus that number, about 25 days. So 476 years, 25 days. That's what's in the 173,880 days. Now, what's significant about this is you've got a 25-day overlap, and we're going to connect into two Nisan moons, the Nisan of Nehemiah and the Nisan Passover of Passion month. But you've got this 25-day overlap, right? So that's going to tell you something. What's it going to tell you? It's going to tell you that the year that Jesus went into Jerusalem on a donkey and the year that he was crucified was an embolismal year in which an extra month of Adar was pushed into the calendar to kick it up, and then the next year comes back 11 days, 11 days, 11 days, and then up again, 11 days. And there's a metonic cycle, so that every 7 years, an extra month of Adar goes into the calendar to correct the fallback. And it goes in a certain sequence called the metonic cycle, which has been used for calendars since the time of the Greeks, and has also by the Hillel, who set up the calendar in 359, some years after the Council of Nicaea, which is interesting. So, so we've got to have a kick-up month of Adar to boot up our Nisan moon in the Passion year. 32 AD was such a year, and the 2 years before it and afterwards were not. So we've got the sun and the moon to give us our indications as to what's going to fit this timeline. So we've got the mean synodic month as well as the sun. So we've got the sun saying 476 revolutions, 476 years plus 25 days, and then we've got the moon. So we can measure out our 173,888 days based upon the lunar cycle, 29.53 days, and what do we end up with? 5,888 moons plus 7 or 8 days. We're not too worried about the fact that we're off by, we have a variability of a day or two. That's nothing. The main thing is that we've got 5,888 moons, and when we go to the moon phase data, we can actually get much more accurate connection. And so we go to astropixels.com. Don't try to find it on the NASA website. They took it off. I think they had some purpose in mind, which I'm not going to talk about. But biblical scholars, they need that information to be able to look at the 70 weeks prophecy. And Dr. Fred Espenak, who's a wonderful astronomer, has put up this website. And I think ultimately, well, it did come from NASA, and ultimately it came from the French. And I think Sir Robert Anderson used French tables as well. So the French, pretty sharp people. And, they were doing this back in the 18th, 19th century. So here are our candidate years for the 69 weeks. And they go from Nisan 447 BC to 30 AD. It doesn't fit. 446 to 31 AD doesn't fit. 445 to 32 AD does fit. Okay, so there's our first confirmation that this is the correct chronology. Next two don't fit either. So the other thing is we've got some confirming proof from Luke the physician in Luke chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, the word of God came to John, and that's when he began his baptism ministry. And it says Jesus also was baptized in that same season. So we're looking here at the 15th year of Tiberius, and the reign of Tiberius began on August the 19th, 14 AD. So we can now do the math, find out when the 14th year is, and the 15th year, and it's 14 years later, and it's 28 AD, and we've got a 3.5 year ministry of Jesus, and that takes us into the Passover of 32. There's our second confirmation for the chronology. And here it is, ministry of Jesus. I understand that some people have argued as to whether there's 3 or 4 Passovers he saw, but basically, this is Sir Robert Anderson's chronology here. Nisan 1 to Nisan 10, March the 14th to April the 6th. The one that I did, March the 15th or 16th to April the 9th or 10th. I couldn't be sure which of the two because of the vagaries of the moon sighting at that particular month. And this is basically how I did it. You start at 32 AD, and we're going to remember you start from known knowns, and then you go to unknown unknowns. So 32 AD looks like it's the year of the Passion. So we start there, and we go and we look for the full moon, and the first full moon that's going to come after the spring equinox of March 20 is going to be the Nisan moon and Passover. And so it's that one, April the 14th. And then we just go back here to the astronomical moon, astronomical new moon, the time of conjunction when the sun, moon, and earth are in alignment together. And that's when you've got the black moon, and that's your start point. And then we have to make allowances for Jerusalem time, so we add 2 hours and 21 minutes to go from Greenwich, England to Jerusalem for the time. And it turns out to be March the 20th, 29th at 10:22 p.m. And so this is the vagary here. If it occurred there, the first new moon viewing opportunity would be shortly after sunset on this day. And if it's not seen on that first day, it will be seen on the second day. So every month you've got to make a decision, boom, 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 between these two following sunsets. And sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes, as here, it's not so obvious. The U.S. Naval Observatory says that the new moon is not usually reliably seen until it's 24 hours old. So I was inclined to say I couldn't really be sure that it was going to be seen then. Sir Robert Anderson thought that it could be seen, which is fine. He put March the 31st as a new moon, and I thought we should include April the 1st as well. By that time, the moon would be 44.6 hours old. It would be well up on the horizon, big and thick, compared to the tiny little sliver of the 20-hour moon. So 2 days for the new moon, the sighted moon, and then we're going 9 days more to go to Nisan 10 when Jesus went through into Jerusalem riding on a donkey to be rejected by his people. And so that's basically, I just put that up for the YouTube people to look at and freeze and look at in more detail. It's rather crowded and small for you to see, but basically we're looking here at Nisan 2 or 3 from my point of view. Sir Robert Anderson thought it was Nisan 1. Big deal. We're looking here at 2 or 3 day difference over nearly 500 years. It's basically a confirmation of Sir Robert Anderson's wonderful work. And so this is going back to Nehemiah now, and 445 BC would be minus 444 because there's no 0 year. And we end up with March the 13th, 4 o'clock in the morning there, about 6:30 in the morning in Jerusalem for the astronomical new moon. And so the first viewing opportunity for the new moon would be here when it's 12 and a half hours old. It's not going to be seen. And it's going to be seen the following night. And that's pretty much a slam dunk there. We can say with reasonable assurance that Nisan 1, 445 BC is March the 15th. And so that's why we were able to say here, March the 15th, Nisan 1. So, yeah, Nisan 1, March 15th. Keep putting that up. I just love to see God's word exonerated. Just love it. And so we've got basically our layout of the final, the first 69 weeks of the 70 weeks prophecy, proving that we've got a 1 7-year period up ahead. That's the take-home lesson. If you don't hear anything else in this presentation, then that's good. And the accuracy in which we did this is 6-figure, 99.9999% accuracy. Even my old professor would be okay with me saying that in science. So if you'd like to get some more information on this, if you just go to endtimepilgrim.org, 70weeks1.htm, you can basically see all the links to the YouTubes and the articles that I got about 7 or 8, I guess, articles and a bunch of YouTubes that more or less follow it. So I'd encourage you to go and do these calculations yourself. It'll do your heart good to know that God is a God who's got definite information compared to all the fluff that we get out here in churchianity today. Just doing church is not going to cut it. It's just not going to do what God has called us to do. So we've got to be diligent in the Scriptures, believe the Scriptures, believe that everything that God says is something that we can take to the bank. We might not understand how it happens right now, but don't discount the Word of God.